We're aboard a double-decker sightseeing bus going through downtown San Francisco. You know, in all the cities I've visited, I've only ridden a double-decker bus once, and that was, you guessed it, in London. But this is going to be really fun. And the company making it all possible, City Sightseeing of San Francisco, has tours that go everywhere. But I wanted to take the Financial District tour. The reason? Well, the diversity of the architecture. Our tour guide, Aaron Kingsley, started pointing out all the swanky stores around Union Square, and I interrupted.
And Burger King. And what? And Burger King. And Burger King.
Construction everywhere, including on the street. I was amazed at how our tour bus driver managed to squeeze through. Ahead of us, a hill where Cameron Diaz filmed a movie. Around the corner, the church where Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe almost got married. You turn another corner, and you're at the gate of Chinatown. And then the tour moves on to City Hall. I asked our tour guide how he knew so much about San Francisco.
When I first moved to the city in 2008, I was a student at San Francisco State, and I took a class called The History of San Francisco with Professor Chandler. And that class alone was enough to disregard any script any tour company has given me and been able just to learn a route and talk about the city freely.
And Aaron knows what he's talking about. I thought I was an expert on San Francisco, but he's the expert. And on the edge of the Financial District, a kind of scene you might see in a smaller urban area, complete with a tire shop. And you see those wires overhead? There are a lot of those cobwebs in San Francisco. Notice this, how close we are to the overhead wire, and look up. Towers in the Financial District, but then this. Some of the most beautiful architecture in North America has to be along the streets of San Francisco. Finally, it was nearly the end of the tour, back to the great tourist trap of San Francisco, the Pier and Wharf area. We made another turn, and look at that. That's the area where the boats leave that go over to Alcatraz. It was kind of sad seeing Pier 39 come up because you knew the tour was about to come to an end. Boy, that was fun, wasn't it? I'll tell you what, I've driven through the streets of San Francisco maybe 100 times, but it's a whole different thing when you've got somebody else driving and you're able to sit up at the top and just enjoy the view. It's Saints Peter and Paul in San Francisco. It's in the Italian section of San Francisco, right off Columbus Avenue. Two of the most photogenic people in the history of the last century wanted to get married here, but the church wouldn't let them because of their past married lives. So they got married downtown, and they came here and had their picture taken.
And Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio had a whirlwind courtship. They were married earlier in the day at San Francisco's courthouse. She was the reigning sex symbol, he was the reigning baseball hero. The news of their marriage on the front page, and so was their divorce less than 10 months later. He never remarried. When Marilyn Monroe died, he started putting flowers on her grave for 20 years. He was a respected pitchman for Mr. Coffee. But he carried the torch for Marilyn the rest of his life. And his dying words were, "Now I'll get to see her again."
Here at the corner of Mason and Washington in San Francisco is a very sturdy building. It's the Cable Car Museum, and admission is free. But there's also something going on inside that, were it not there, the cable cars wouldn't work at all.
And what's going on inside is the pulling of the cables by massive General Electric motors. They pull tens of thousands of feet of cable under the streets of San Francisco. And the technology has been the same for 100 years, since Andrew Halliday saw horses being beaten when they couldn't carry their loads up steep hills. He used mining technology to develop the cable car. And within 5 years, every major steep hill in San Francisco no longer had horses, it had cables singing underneath the street. And the technology hasn't changed. The motors in the big building pull the cables under the street, and a clamp at the bottom of the car clamps down on the cable. It's as simple as that. And as I say, it hasn't changed in a very long time. There used to be a lot more cable car lines in San Francisco than now. Most were phased out in the 50s, replaced by buses, but activists saved the cable cars. And so when you ride today on these tracks, you have to realize they aren't really necessary. San Francisco could have buses, and the money you pay to ride in no way completely pays for the upkeep and maintenance of these cars, many of which are decades and decades and decades old. But cable cars represent San Francisco. They are the image of San Francisco. But they have to play second fiddle to traffic. After all, they can't leave the tracks. And at this corner, they were moving a big construction crane, holding up the timetable of the cable cars for more than 15 minutes. They slowly were able to get through. Cable cars, day and night, the magic of San Francisco.
We're on the south side of San Francisco in a lovely neighborhood at a place called Aptos. This is the Aptos Middle School behind me. This is kind of the back entrance. And behind you is a beautiful park where people are playing baseball and riding around on their, whatever you call these little things, having fun today. The reason we're here is that many, many, many years ago, a young girl went to school here. She would later say that she felt very nurtured, she learned a lot, and made some great friends here. And the girl grew up to be Carol Channing.
And even before Carol left here, teachers realized she was something special. By the time she was in college, her teachers were telling her, "Go to New York." In the Big Apple, she took minor parts, then was discovered by the world when she played in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. After that success, she starred in the short-lived Broadway musical Showgirl. But then when Jerry Herman selected her to play Dolly Levi in Hello, Dolly, her world changed forever. That made her a worldwide megastar. When she was the mystery guest on What's My Line, she received one of the biggest ovations in the history of that program. Over the years on Broadway and in countless revivals and road shows, Carol would don the costume of Dolly Levi more than 5,000 times. For it is indeed her portrayal of Dolly we remember best.
Yes, Carol Channing always said she had a nurturing childhood and went to a wonderful school called the Aptos Middle School. And here it is, in a great little neighborhood in a part of San Francisco where the tourists never go. You know, every year people come to the windy and hilly streets of San Francisco to try to find where movies and TV shows were filmed. For example, they try to see where cars flew off the street in Bullitt, or Cameron Diaz in high-heel shoes walked up a steep street. They go to find where Mrs. Doubtfire was filmed, or they trace the streets of San Francisco. But for my money, the most historic preserved movie site in the city is right here. It's 611 Laguna. It's where a very eccentric producer named Erich von Stroheim filmed Greed in 1923. And if you look at the intersection today, you'll see that back then it looked about the same, except there used to be a cable car here. Von Stroheim took the book McTeague and turned it into the movie Greed, filming every word and every page. It starts as a wonderful love affair starring Zazu Pitts, who then wins a lottery. She ignores her friends and her husband, who desperately needs money. He eventually goes stark raving mad when he finds out she's given the money to her boyfriend, and he follows the boyfriend into Death Valley, where they are both trapped. I won't tell you how it ends, And von Stroheim broke new ground by filming all the interior scenes here, ceiling, walls, and all. And that had never been done before. We're walking across Bay Street in the Fisherman's Wharf section of San Francisco. Now the funny thing is, this street doesn't lead to the bay, and there is no bay here. But there used to be.
This sign would have been well out in the bay, as well as this shopping center with its own parking garage. And to the north, Pier 39 and the wharf, one of the busiest tourist draws in San Francisco. Even the area where the ferries leave to go to Alcatraz, completely out in the bay at one time. The blue area represents the part of San Francisco that's been filled in on the east side. We're up here on the north side in what's called North Beach. This is the area that was filled in, or we'd be underwater. And to the south, the financial district, most of it underwater. There are 12 sunken ships under the streets. And to the south, the Major League Ballpark in what was once China Basin, and all of the wharfs that serve the industrial parts of San Francisco. Yes, some people do remember a time before they shoved the rubble from the earthquake into the bay to build a bigger city. On this chilly morning, I found two people from a small rescue mission. A crowd was gathering and they were entertaining everybody with hymns. And the audience was homeless people. It's estimated that in San Francisco alone, there are as many as 10,000 people who are homeless. They weren't taking up a collection here. These people were giving of themselves, singing hymns, and in the back, yet to be opened, a late breakfast and early lunch. There are a lot of people like this out there helping other people. They're largely invisible too, for the work they do is among a group of people most of us never see, or at least we ignore.
We're on Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, and you know, I don't think I've ever been here this early in the morning. This is the area where all the tourists flock to go to the restaurants and buy the cheap cameras and come here by every conceivable kind of tour bus from all over the West. It's also the area from which the ferries leave. One of them goes over there to Alcatraz. It's one of the great tourist traps on the American West Coast, and there's something else too. This is where people come to eat, and also, as you can tell, just to walk around. And over here is the Bodine Sourdough Bread Bakery.
And Bodine has been a fixture here on Fisherman's Wharf for a long time. It started back in 1849 and has been producing some of the most tasty sourdough bread in the history of San Francisco. We tried to get inside to do filming, but just couldn't seem to connect with the PR lady. So through the window, we saw the artisans working on other specialty breads, and not just sourdough. But a look inside shows the automated equipment that produces the hundreds of thousands of sourdough loaves you see every year. A unique taste. Bodine, a taste of San Francisco. You see the overhead wires? I talk about them a lot because they're not just cobwebs in San Francisco, they're the lifeline to a lot of transportation. Here in the Mission District, for example, the streetcar line that runs down Church Street eventually comes up through the park. These are sleek, rather new cars, not like the streetcars of old, and they're all run by Muni. And of course, Muni runs the buses, and look, more electric wires. There are also some interesting places where these streetcars converge and switch off. This is kind of a rail yard. And yes, there is a switch here, just as you might have on a model railroad, and the switch is run by a switch controller that will be switched soon. Riding these cars is lots of fun. I tried an experiment this time. Didn't rent a car in San Francisco. Just watched the neighborhoods go by through the half-murky windows, and in some places saw some beautiful scenery. Ah, the wires of San Francisco.
We're in Union Square in downtown San Francisco, and Union Square is about as much downtown San Francisco as you can get. There have been demonstrations and protests over the years here and a lot of wonderful arts festivals. We're right in the middle of a cluster of very expensive places to eat and shop. Saks Fifth Avenue, Tiffany, Louis Vuitton, and Burger King.
But it isn't Burger King people come to see, it's the shops and stores. This area could not be any more centrally located. There are more upscale shops, beauty salons, theaters, and merchandising stores in this part of San Francisco than anywhere else except Beverly Hills, California. That yellow line is the Powell Street cable car that runs right beside the park. It was a sand dune until 1850, and it's undergone a lot of changes over the years from what it was then to what it is today. Here's 1920 and the big Christmas tree. Yes, Union Square has kept changing over the years, but it has always been a rallying place.
Oh, and by the way, this place was shown in a clip at the beginning of Citizen Kane. Remember? Where somebody made the speech against Kane?
He is today what he has always been, and always will be, a fascist.
It's Union Square in downtown San Francisco. You know, one of the great things about cities such as San Francisco, Seattle, and parts of New York City is that they still have little intimate neighborhoods with little intimate cafes. Now, Pat's isn't open for the full day, but it is open for most of the day, breakfast and also lunch. It's a great little place with a wonderful menu, and it's affordable. But the thing about restaurants like this is you have to look for them.
But in the case of Pat's, you don't have to look far. Look a little to the north, and there's a cable car. You see, the tracks for the Powell-Mason line run right past Pat's, and they end just a block to the north near Fisherman's Wharf. Pat's is a great friendly place. It's well lit. The sun just pours in the morning. It's one of those places with a great menu and just enough room and Wi-Fi. And the menu is full but simple, printed on both sides of one sheet. I had what's called the Albi. That's albacore tuna with walnuts. It was kind of an adventure. You can tell I liked it.
So the next time you're taking a trip to any medium-sized or larger city, get off onto the side streets and find a place like Pat's Cafe. You'll be glad you did.
It's billed as the oldest Italian restaurant in the United States, Fior d'Italia in San Francisco. It's one of those, oh yes, and they do serve Diet Coke. It's one of those lovely places where you just want to sit and spend a couple of hours. And you know, the magic of fine dining is not so much the food and the ambiance, it's the personal service. And there's a lot of it here. This restaurant prides itself in the way it takes care of its clientele and also its repeat business. I started out with a traditional thing where you have vinegar and oil and you put bread in it, and I still don't know what it's called. I ordered this great chicken dish with vegetables. Now look at this. It's beautiful white meat chicken with prosciutto ham and cheese on top. You can tell I didn't like it very much. And, of course, I finished it with Diet Coke instead of wine. There are fine wines served here and a lot of great music on special nights. It's Fior d'Italia in the North Beach section of San Francisco. And I didn't have any trouble finding it. It was right beside my hotel.
It's a windy morning in San Francisco, and we're at the intersection of Beach and Divisadero. Behind me is a beautiful building. Beautiful because it was only rebuilt in 1989. This was the building that was on all the newscasts around the world the night of the World Series earthquake. And before the night was over, in the Marina District, built on landfill where the ground turned to jello, all hell broke loose. Buildings like this one managed to stand up, kind of. They didn't burn. But fires were the problem everywhere else. It was this intersection, Divisadero and Beach, that became the epicenter for much of the damage. When the shock waves came through the area that night, right before the World Series game, they seemed to hit this area the hardest. And before it was over, gas mains broke and fire was everywhere. The national networks covered it live. The marina would have burned had they not been able to get water from the bay. And one of the more amazing things I saw right after the earthquake when I came here just a couple of weeks later was behind this school. Now the school won't let me photograph back there because the playground is full of kids and that violates their rules. But the playground, which is now flat, beautiful asphalt, was a waffle iron. Remember those photos you've seen of Death Valley where the land is so parched? That's what that parking lot looked like, because the ground during the quake had turned to jello. A World's Fair was here in 1915 to celebrate the rebirth of San Francisco. The building on the left, the Palace of Fine Arts, all that remains. The Green Line, Bay Street, used to be the shore. Everything north of it was filled in with rubble from the 1906 earthquake. That's why it turns to jello. It's called liquefaction. When the area started to quake, everything started to move. And that's why this building ended up looking like this and needed to be restored to what it is today.
Can you see that tower in the distance? It's called Coit Tower. More correctly, the Lillian Coit Tower. It's built on what was called Telegraph Hill in San Francisco. It dominates the northern section of the city, and the view from there is magnificent. It's called Telegraph Hill because back in the days of shipping, it was important for messages to be gotten early to San Francisco from ship. They used semaphore, and men on Telegraph Hill with telescopes would pick up the message and send it down a telegraph line. Lillian Coit was an odd woman. She wore pants, chased fire trucks, and got drunk regularly. But when she died, she left a ton of money to beautify San Francisco. And one of those beautifications, now that the telegraph was no longer necessary, was Coit Tower. And just because she chased fire trucks, it was not built in the shape of a hose nozzle, although that's the urban legend.
We're in front of Symphony Hall. Some really great music has come out of here since this building was built to pay tribute to the world's greatest music. And the current conductor is a fellow who has brought a new kind of slant to classical music, Michael Tilson Thomas.
Michael Tilson Thomas is a native of L.A. His dad was a stage manager, and his family traditions go back to the Yiddish Theater in Manhattan. He's renowned for his interpretations of the works of Gustav Mahler. Now, some of Mahler's symphonies run an hour and a half. Thomas recorded all 9. Now, I first came across Michael Tilson Thomas in the late 80s. I went to Miami Beach to see and hear an incredible project he had put together, the New World Symphony. It was a world-class orchestra made up of young kids who had just graduated from college and needed a place to stay, practice, and work while awaiting a call from a major orchestra. Next, I heard a recording he had done of George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. He found a piano roll Gershwin had recorded, covered up the holes Gershwin had punched to put in the orchestra parts, leaving him only George Gershwin. Then he got the original number of musicians with Gershwin at the keyboard and recorded Rhapsody in Blue, the way it was first heard on opening night. And you know that clarinet part at the open? That glissando is usually played symphonically. In the Tilson Thomas version, it's really jazzy. And the theme from Rhapsody in Blue, that big orchestral work we hear behind all the United Airlines commercials, well, it was jazzy too. And there's a lot of percussion. You don't hear that in symphonic versions today, but that's the way George meant it. And I'd love to play you the recording that Michael Tilson Thomas did of Rhapsody in Blue, but the copyright folks at YouTube would come down on me like a herd of buzzards. A lot of people criticized his interpretation, but he tried to make it sound the way it did the night George Gershwin premiered the work. Michael Tilson Thomas is the 11th music director of the San Francisco Symphony. A lot of people just love him.
You might want to get that recording he did of Rhapsody in Blue. It's interesting, and in a way, it's starkly magnificent. Can you see the sign up here? It's Lansing Street in San Francisco, just south of Market. And there's not much to it. As a matter of fact, it kind of looks like a paved alley. And it actually is. But it's a street.
And major parts of downtown San Francisco are festooned with little tiny alleys marked as streets. If you stare, they're everywhere. Let's pick one block in particular. This block, and the streets do run at a 45-degree angle in this part of San Francisco, has two narrow alleys, Washburn Street and Grace Street. Now, as I say, these alleys aren't really very much. But it was decided to build them after this event, the San Francisco earthquake and fire. Let me explain. Before the fire, this block was a solid bunch of buildings. There was no access to the central core. If fire broke out there through the roof, well, the firemen couldn't get in. So when the city rebuilt, city fathers mandated that city blocks be pierced by alleys, no matter how small, so firefighting equipment can get in. Streets that are alleys, they're all over.
It's almost dark here in the San Francisco Bay Area, but can you see this magnificent structure behind me? It's the new cable-stayed bridge over that part of San Francisco Bay. And this bridge has been a long time in coming.
The bridge itself is a monumental achievement, a huge anchorage in the middle of the bay to hold up two suspension bridges. The cables are neatly wrapped in San Francisco as they head for their anchorage, the thing that holds them down. At night, the Bay Bridge is lighted, and the view from Treasure Island is magnificent of the bridge and the skyline. But let me show you something about the bridge. First of all, here's the San Francisco side, here's the anchorage, and here's a great big hill on an adjacent island. When the Bay Bridge was built in the 30s, they went out with one suspension bridge from San Francisco toward Oakland and finished what you might call half of the west side. Then that huge anchorage let them continue on with a second bridge. They had to build a tunnel, the biggest of its kind in the world. Then on to the Oakland side with a huge cantilever bridge and trusses, and it was here, during the 1989 World Series earthquake, that something happened, and that was part of the upper deck falling onto the lower deck. So instead of retrofitting the old bridge on the east side, they decided to build a brand new span. But they had to do so and keep traffic moving. An ingenious movable span was put in, traffic was moved over to it, while the cable-stayed section was finished. The Bay Bridge is a heavy-duty monster that's carried traffic since the 1930s. And, you know, it may be a monster, but it has its own kind of beauty. And you can't go anywhere in San Francisco without seeing it somewhere on the skyline. Some people prefer the Golden Gate Bridge in all of its grandeur, but the Bay Area wouldn't work were it not for the old, trusty, clumsy, wonderful Bay Bridge. And now part of it's being replaced with a cable-stayed bridge that has been about a decade in the making with some incredible engineering. I'm Dennis Daly with your Daily News Update.